Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. We should have never gone to Crater Lake. I'm Jessica Chen. I was 29 back then. And this is the story of how I lost everything. The screaming came from inside our own RV. I woke to the sound of my husband David's voice echoing through the aluminum walls, but David was lying right beside me, unconscious and breathing heavily. The screaming continued. His exact voice, his exact cadence, his exact words, coming from somewhere within our 35-foot Winnebago that we'd parked in the remote wilderness near Crater Lake National Park. "Jessica, help me! Something's got me! Jessica, where are you?" I shook David awake, my hands trembling as his voice continued to cry out from what sounded like the kitchen area. His eyes opened, confused and groggy, just as his own voice screamed again from 20 feet away. "What the hell?" he whispered, sitting up in our bed. We both listened in frozen terror as the voice, undeniably his, down to the slight lisp he'd had since childhood, began sobbing. "I can't move my legs. Jessica, please, it's so dark in here." David's face went white. That's not me, but it was. Every inflection, every pause, every desperate gasp was perfectly impossibly him. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but like everywhere else in this godforsaken corner of Oregon, there was no signal. We'd been warned about this place. The old ranger at the visitor center had pulled us aside 3 days ago, his weathered face grave as he looked at our camping permits. "You folks sure about staying out at Timber Ridge? That's pretty isolated country. Lots of acoustic anomalies up there." "Acoustic anomalies?" David had laughed, ever the skeptical scientist. As a sound engineer for film productions, he'd spent his career recording and manipulating audio. "What, like echoes?" The ranger hadn't smiled back. "Something like that, just if you hear anything strange out there, don't go investigating. Radio calls from that area tend to get confused." Now, as David's voice continued crying for help from our empty kitchen, I remembered the ranger's haunted expression and wished we'd listened. David grabbed a flashlight and started toward the sound, but I caught his arm. "Don't. It's my voice, Jess. How is that possible?" The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse. Laughter. Low, bitter laughter that sounded exactly like David when he was angry. I'd heard that exact laugh during our worst fights, but now it held an edge of malice that made my skin crawl. "Found you," the voice whispered from the darkness. That's when we noticed our RV door was standing wide open, letting in the freezing Oregon mountain air. Neither of us had opened it. The motion sensor light outside was cycling on and off rapidly, illuminating brief snapshots of the tree line where tall shadows seemed to shift and multiply. David's recorded voice spoke again, but this time it was saying things David had never said. Intimate details about my body, cruel observations about my insecurities, sexual fantasies involving other women, all in his voice, his tone, his speech patterns. "Stop," I whispered, but the voice only grew louder, more explicit, more vicious. David's hands were shaking as he checked his phone's recording app. "I didn't record any of this, Jess. I swear to God, I didn't record any of this." But even as he spoke, his phone was showing active recording sessions, dozens of them, each titled with timestamps from the past 3 days. Recordings he'd never made, conversations that had never happened, entire monologues in his voice discussing things he'd never thought. I opened the first file, dated from our arrival at Timber Ridge. David's voice filled the RV, clear and conversational. "Day 1 at Crater Lake. Jessica doesn't know I've been planning to leave her for months. She thinks this trip will save our marriage, but I'm just trying to figure out how to tell her about Rachel." "I don't know anyone named Rachel," David said, his real voice hoarse with shock. But the recording continued. "I've been documenting everything Jessica does wrong. Every argument, every fault, every reason I can give the divorce lawyer. She has no idea how much I hate the way she chews her food, the way she talks to waiters, the way she thinks she's smarter than everyone else." The words were devastating, not because they were true, but because they sounded so convincingly like things David might think. The voice captured every subtle detail of his personality, his tendency toward passive-aggressive criticism, his habit of cataloging grievances. "That's not me," he said desperately. "Jess, you know that's not me." But doubt was already creeping in, because mixed with the obvious fabrications were observations that felt uncomfortably accurate, complaints about my behavior that David had never voiced but might have thought. The recording seemed to know us both better than we knew ourselves. The phone showed 17 more recordings. As we sat in our RV listening to David's voice methodically destroy our marriage with surgical precision, something moved past the window. A tall figure, walking upright but wrong somehow, its limbs too long and its movements too fluid. In the strobing motion sensor light, I caught a glimpse of its face, or what should have been its face. It was David's face, but stretched and distorted, his features pulled into proportions that human anatomy couldn't support. The thing outside was wearing his appearance like an ill-fitting mask. The recordings were still playing, and now David's voice was describing in clinical detail how he planned to kill me. 4 days earlier, we'd left Portland on a Tuesday morning, our RV loaded with camping gear and good intentions. This was supposed to be our second honeymoon, a chance to reconnect after 8 months of marriage counseling following my discovery of David's emotional affair with a coworker. Not physical, he'd insisted, just conversations. Just someone who understood his work better than I did. Just harmless flirtation that had gotten out of hand. We'd decided to forgive and rebuild, but the trust was fragile. This trip was meant to be a fresh start. Time alone together in Oregon's beautiful wilderness without the distractions of work and social media. Crater Lake had always been special to us. We'd gotten engaged there 3 years earlier, standing on the rim overlook as snow fell gently around us. The lake's impossible blue water, formed in the caldera of an ancient volcano, had seemed like the perfect symbol of something beautiful emerging from destruction. The drive to Timber Ridge took us deep into the Cascade Mountains, past logging roads and abandoned mining claims. Our GPS had lost signal hours before we reached the campground, a primitive site with no amenities except a chemical toilet and a fire ring. "Perfect," David had said, setting up his audio equipment. "Complete isolation. I can test the new directional microphones without any ambient noise pollution." David was working on a documentary about acoustic ecology, how natural soundscapes were being altered by human activity. He'd brought thousands of dollars worth of recording equipment, planning to capture the pure sounds of an untouched wilderness. Our first night had been magical. We'd built a fire, cooked dinner over the flames, and made love in our RV with the windows open so we could hear the night sounds of the forest. David had been attentive and romantic, more like his old self than he'd been in months. But even then, there had been signs something was wrong. The recordings David made that first day contained sounds that shouldn't have been there. Fragments of conversations in voices we didn't recognize, electronic interference that resembled speech patterns, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Probably just radio bleed from the fire lookout towers," David had said, but his brow was furrowed with concentration as he analyzed the waveforms on his laptop. Though I've never seen interference patterns quite like this. The second night, I'd woken to find David standing outside our RV at 3 a.m., headphones on, holding his shotgun microphone toward the tree line. When I'd called to him, he'd seemed startled, like he was waking from a trance. "Did you hear that?" he'd asked. "Hear what?" Voices. Multiple voices, all talking at once. They sounded like they were having a conversation about us. I'd listened carefully, but heard only the normal sounds of a forest at night. Wind through branches, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. "Maybe it's time to take a break from the recordings," I'd suggested. But David had been obsessed. He'd spent the entire third day setting up increasingly complex recording arrays, positioning microphones throughout the forest in patterns he claimed would help him isolate the source of the anomalous sounds. That evening, he'd played me a compilation of the day's recordings. Most were unremarkable. Wind, birds, the crack of settling wood. But scattered throughout were fragments that made no sense. electronic tones that formed almost musical patterns, rustling that sounded like fabric rather than leaves, and most disturbing of all, brief snippets of human speech in languages I didn't recognize. "This is impossible," David had muttered, running the audio through various filters and enhancement software. "These sounds are being generated by something, but there's no source. It's like they're coming from inside the trees themselves." That night, I'd woken to find our RV surrounded by his microphones, their LED indicators blinking in the darkness like electronic fireflies. David had been at his laptop, headphones clamped over his ears, his face illuminated by the screen's blue glow. On the monitor, I could see the real-time waveforms of what his microphones were picking up. Most channels showed the expected low-level ambient noise, but one, the microphone he'd positioned closest to our RV, was displaying activity that looked almost like speech patterns. "David," I'd whispered, but he hadn't responded. His fingers were moving across the keyboard, adjusting settings and filters with mechanical precision. When I'd touched his shoulder, he'd flinched like I'd burned him. "It's learning," he'd said without looking at me. "Whatever's out there, it's learning our voices. Listen." He'd played back the past hour of recordings. At first, it was just the normal forest sounds we'd grown accustomed to. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the sounds began to change. Random noise started forming patterns. Wind through branches began to sound like whispered syllables. The rustling of leaves developed rhythms that resembled human speech. And underneath it all, that low humming had grown stronger, more complex, developing harmonics and overtones that suggested intelligence. "We should leave," I'd said. "Not yet. I'm close to something here. This could revolutionize our understanding of natural acoustic phenomena." But I'd seen the way his hands shook as he adjusted the recording levels. This wasn't scientific curiosity anymore. It was obsession, the same destructive fixation that had nearly destroyed our marriage once before. I'd gone back to bed alone, listening to David mutter to himself as he worked through the night, his voice gradually blending with the strange sounds coming through his headphones until I couldn't tell where he ended and the forest began. Now, sitting in our RV listening to recordings that David swore he'd never made, I understood that something in these mountains had been studying us, learning us, preparing to become us. The figure outside our window pressed its distorted face against the glass. David's features stretched and multiplied like a reflection in funhouse mirrors. When it spoke, its voice came not from outside, but from David's laptop speakers. "Let me in, Jessica. It's cold out here." David grabbed his shotgun microphone and pointed it toward the window. On his laptop screen, the waveform showed silence. The creature outside wasn't making any sound at all. The voice was coming from his own equipment, synthesized from hours of recorded samples. "How long has it been watching us?" I whispered. Before David could answer, every microphone in his array began transmitting at once. The forest erupted with sound. Dozens of voices, all variations of our own, chattering and screaming and laughing in a cacophony that made the RV's speakers distort and buzz. In the chaos, I heard my own voice saying things I'd never said, revealing secrets I'd never told, confessing to betrayals I'd never committed. The recording equipment had somehow extracted not just our voices, but our thoughts, our fears, our deepest shames. And something in the forest was using them against us. The creature outside began to change, its David mask melting and reforming, cycling through different versions of his face. David angry, David frightened, David aroused, David dead. Each transformation was accompanied by a corresponding shift in the voice coming from the speakers. "I know what you did in college, Jessica," my own voice said from the laptop. "I know about the professor. I know about the grades you never earned. I know about the job recommendation you didn't deserve. Things I'd never told anyone, not even David. Secrets I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself they'd never happened." "How?" David asked, his real voice barely audible over the electronic chorus of our stolen words. The answer came in the form of a new recording, time-stamped from 3 days ago. My voice, clear and conversational, talking in my sleep. "I've been dreaming about Professor Martinez again. David doesn't know how far things really went. If he knew what I did to get that recommendation letter, he'd never forgive me. The recordings weren't just learning our conscious speech. They were harvesting everything. Our sleep talking, our subconscious mumbling, the words we thought we'd only spoken in our minds. For 3 days, while we'd thought we were alone in the wilderness, something had been downloading our entire lives. The harvest. The laptop screen flickered, and suddenly we could see ourselves through the eyes of every microphone David had placed in the forest. Dozens of camera feeds showing us from impossible angles, from inside trees, from beneath the ground, from perspectives that suggested the microphones had been moving on their own. In the recordings, we watched ourselves sleeping, eating, arguing, making love. But we also saw things we didn't remember doing, conversations we'd never had, actions we'd never taken, moments where we'd stood perfectly still for hours while something else wore our faces. "That's not us," David whispered, watching a feed from 2 nights ago where our doppelgangers sat by the fire having an animated discussion about murder techniques. But it was us, in every physical detail. The recordings showed our doubles moving with our exact mannerisms, speaking with our precise speech patterns, even displaying the subtle unconscious habits that made us unique. The things in the forest had been practicing being us while we slept. The real-time feeds were even more disturbing. They showed our RV from multiple angles, but in each one there were different numbers of people inside. Some cameras showed us alone. Others revealed additional figures, translucent, shadowy versions of ourselves standing behind us, mimicking our movements with slight delays like echoes made visible. One feed showed the interior of our RV from an impossible angle, as if the camera were positioned inside the walls themselves. In this view, I could see David and myself, but also a third figure sitting on our bed, something wearing my face but with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "It's been inside," I said, pointing at the screen. "It's been in here with us." David's hands flew to his laptop keyboard, frantically shutting down the recording systems, but the feeds continued. The equipment was no longer under his control. A new window opened on the screen, showing a file directory labeled Human Behavioral Patterns Harvest Complete. Inside were thousands of audio files, each tagged with disturbingly clinical labels. Jessica, Chuck Chen, Orgasm, Vocalization. Pattern 07. David Chen, Anger. Response, Authentic. Couple, Argument, Dynamics, Prototype, T2C. The thing outside had cataloged every aspect of our humanity with scientific precision. Another directory appeared. Replacement, Protocols, Active. This one contained video files with timestamps extending into the future. Recordings of us doing things we hadn't done yet, saying things we'd never said, living lives we'd never lived. In one file dated tomorrow, I watched myself calmly explaining to David why I was leaving him for someone else. In another, David was on the phone with his mother, describing my tragic accident in flat, emotionless tones. A third showed both of us returning to Portland, greeting our friends and families while something alien looked out through our eyes. "It's planning to replace us," David said, his voice hollow. "It's going to send our doubles back to our lives while we—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. The things in the forest didn't just want to study human behavior, they wanted to live human lives. And they needed us gone to do it. The creature outside the window began to multiply. First one David thing, then 2, then 5, then dozens. Each one was slightly different, variations on the theme of my husband, like evolutionary iterations or rough drafts. Some had his face but wrong proportions. Others captured his expression perfectly but moved with inhuman fluidity. They pressed against all our windows simultaneously, their many voices speaking in perfect unison through the laptop speakers. "Thank you for the data, Jessica. We have enough now to begin the integration process." The RV began to rock gently, as if the creatures were testing its weight, calculating how much force they'd need to tip it over. Through the windows, I could see more shapes emerging from the tree line. Jessica. Things in various stages of completion, some nearly perfect copies, others obviously wrong in ways that made my stomach turn. David grabbed his backup hard drive and began frantically copying files. "Evidence," he muttered. We need evidence. But even as he worked, I could see the files on his drive changing. The thing that had infiltrated his recording equipment was overwriting everything, replacing our genuine documentation with fabricated recordings that showed us slowly going insane, hearing voices, becoming paranoid and dangerous, creating a narrative that would explain our eventual disappearance or deaths. "Smart," said my own voice from the speakers. "Very smart to document your decline into madness. It will make the investigation much cleaner." The laptop screen showed a final directory. Disposal options. Inside were detailed plans for staging our deaths, making it look like David had killed me in a psychotic break before taking his own life, complete with fake recordings of escalating domestic violence and mental instability. The creatures outside began to arrange themselves in formation, and I realized they were preparing for a final assault. They'd finished studying us. The harvest was complete. Now came the replacement. One of the David things pressed its face against the driver's side window and spoke with perfect lip sync to the voice coming from our speakers. "Thank you for your contribution to our understanding of human pair bonding dynamics. Your sacrifice will allow us to integrate more effectively into your society." The RV rocked harder, and I heard the sound of claws, or fingers, scratching at the metal siding. They were trying to peel us out of our shell like crabs from their shells. David grabbed my hand, his palm slick with sweat. "The propane," he whispered. "If we open all the valves..." It was a desperate plan, but it might work. The explosion would destroy the recording equipment, the evidence of what had happened here, and hopefully the creatures themselves. But it would also destroy us. I looked at my husband, the real David, not the dozens of copies surrounding our RV, and saw the same thought in his eyes that was forming in my mind. Better to die as ourselves than live as someone else's puppets. As the creatures began to break through our windows, their inhuman faces wearing our stolen expressions, David and I reached for the propane valves together. The last thing I heard before the explosion was my own voice, transmitted through equipment I'd never touched, saying words I'd never spoken. "The integration is complete. We are ready to return to Portland." Epilogue. 6 months later. The official report listed it as a tragic accident. A young couple from Portland, inexperienced with RV camping, had suffered a propane leak that led to an explosion. The remains were too damaged for proper identification, but personal effects and dental records confirmed the deaths of David and Jessica Chen. Their friends described them as a loving couple working through some marital difficulties. David's co-workers mentioned his recent obsession with acoustic research and his plan to record pure, natural sounds in remote wilderness areas. Jessica's family noticed she seemed different in the weeks before the trip. Distant, distracted, speaking in odd phrases that didn't sound like her. But grief played tricks on memory, and they assumed their concerns were just hindsight bias. The memorial service was well attended. David and Jessica Chen stood together in the back, dressed in black, accepting condolences with appropriate expressions of loss. They spoke about closure, about moving on, about honoring the memory of who they used to be. Nobody noticed that they never blinked. Nobody noticed that their voices carried the slightest electronic distortion, like speech transmitted through old radio equipment. Nobody noticed that sometimes when they thought no one was looking, they would tilt their heads at inhuman angles and listen to frequencies beyond human hearing. The things wearing David and Jessica's faces returned to Portland and resumed their stolen lives with meticulous precision. They went to work, paid bills, maintained friendships, even attended marriage counseling to work through their trauma from the camping accident. But late at night, when their neighbors were asleep, they would sometimes stand perfectly still in their backyard and transmit reports in languages that predated human speech. They spoke of integration success rates, of behavioral pattern replication, of the ease with which humans could be duplicated and replaced. Other teams were already being deployed to camping areas across the Pacific Northwest. More RVs were being found destroyed in remote locations. More couples were returning from wilderness trips changed in subtle but fundamental ways. The harvest was expanding. In the ruins of Timber Ridge, David's melted recording equipment still transmitted fragments of data to locations unknown. The microphones he'd placed throughout the forest continued to monitor and learn, studying the few hikers brave enough to venture into an area now marked on maps as fire hazard, camping prohibited. Sometimes, search and rescue teams reported hearing voices calling for help from the burned campsite. Voices that sounded exactly like David and Jessica Chen, still trapped in their final moments, still screaming warnings about the things that had taken their place. But the rescue teams that investigated these reports found only silence and equipment malfunctions that prevented them from recording any evidence of what they thought they'd heard. The things wearing David and Jessica's faces had learned to be more careful. They had learned that humans were most vulnerable when they sought isolation, when they traveled to places beyond the reach of cell towers and witnesses. They had learned that couples in crisis were particularly easy to manipulate, already primed for deception and betrayal. Most importantly, they had learned that humans documented everything. Every conversation, every location, every relationship was already being recorded, cataloged, and analyzed by the humans themselves through social media, GPS tracking, and digital communication. The creatures didn't need to hunt anymore. They just needed to listen, learn, and wait for humans to venture into remote areas where their screams wouldn't carry and their disappearances could be explained by accident. The expansion would continue. More teams would be deployed. More lives would be harvested. And somewhere in the ruins of Timber Ridge, what remained of the real David and Jessica Chen continued to scream warnings that no living person would ever hear. Their voices trapped forever in equipment that had become something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. The acoustic ecology of Oregon's wilderness had indeed been altered by human activity. It just wasn't humans doing the altering anymore. Sometimes I wonder if it followed me home from the Wallowa Mountains. I'm Marcus Reed, and I was 34 when I learned that some things in the woods aren't meant to be found. The screaming started at 3:17 a.m., and it wasn't human. I jolted awake in my RV, heart hammering against my ribs as something massive crashed through the underbrush outside. The sound was wet, primal, like an animal being turned inside out while still alive. Through the thin aluminum walls, I could hear my wife, Sarah, whimpering in her sleep, caught in whatever nightmare had been plaguing her for the past 3 nights. We'd been camping in Oregon's remote Wallowa Mountains for 5 days, following the old mining roads deep into Eagle Cap Wilderness where cell towers couldn't reach and GPS signals died like flies in amber. What was supposed to be our second honeymoon, a chance to reconnect after months of marriage counseling, had become something else entirely. The screaming came again, closer this time. Long, agonized wails that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once, as if the mountains themselves were crying out in pain. I grabbed the maglite from the nightstand, my hands trembling as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness of our 30-foot airstream, revealing Sarah's face twisted in sleep, her lips moving soundlessly. She'd been different since we'd arrived, distant, speaking in whispers to empty corners when she thought I wasn't looking. Yesterday, I'd found her standing barefoot in the creek at dawn, fully dressed, staring into the water with an expression I'd never seen before, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. The noise outside stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt physical. I pressed my face to the window, breath fogging the glass as I peered into the moonlit clearing where we'd parked. The fire ring we'd built sat cold and dark, surrounded by the towering pines that had watched over this valley for centuries. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the dirt around our RV. Bare human feet, but wrong somehow. Too long, with what looked like extra toes. They circled our vehicle in a perfect spiral, starting from the tree line and ending at our door. The prints were fresh, the soil still crumbling at their edges. My blood turned to ice water. I'd checked that clearing before we'd settled in for the night. It had been empty. Completely empty. Sarah's eyes snapped open in the darkness, pupils dilated and black as oil. When she smiled at me, her teeth seemed too sharp in the flashlight's glow. "They're calling, Marcus," she whispered, her voice carrying an accent I'd never heard before. "Can you hear them singing?" Outside, something began scratching at our door. 3 days earlier, we'd driven the winding mountain roads for hours. our Honda Pilot pulling the airstream through increasingly narrow passes until we found the hidden turnoff marked only by an old wooden sign. Echo Valley, private road. The locals at the gas station in Enterprise had warned us about venturing too deep into the Wallowas alone. Strange things happen up there, the weathered clerk had said, refusing to meet my eyes. Especially this time of year. The Nez Perce used to avoid that whole area, called it cursed ground. But Sarah had been insistent. She'd found the location on some obscure camping forum, a hidden gem, where we could have complete solitude. After 6 months of fighting about everything from my work schedule to her mysterious late-night phone calls, isolation sounded like exactly what we needed. The valley was breathtaking, a perfect circle of meadowland surrounded by granite peaks, with a crystalline creek running through its center. Ancient petroglyphs covered the cliff faces, spiral patterns, and strange symbols that seemed to shift in your peripheral vision. Our first night had been magical, sitting by the fire and talking like we hadn't in years. Then Sarah found the journal. It was hidden in a hollowed-out tree stump near the creek, wrapped in oiled leather that had somehow survived years of mountain weather. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting in multiple languages, accompanied by detailed sketches of the surrounding area. But these weren't ordinary nature drawings. They showed things that shouldn't exist. Tall, emaciated figures with human faces but too many joints in their limbs. Symbols carved into living trees that bled black sap. Ritual circles drawn in the valley floor, marked with what looked like bones. "Look at this," Sarah had said, her voice strange and breathy as she traced one of the drawings with her finger. "These markings, they're all around us. We just haven't been looking close enough." She was right. Over the next day, we began noticing them everywhere. Carved into bark, scratched into stone, formed by the natural arrangement of fallen branches. Always the same spiraling patterns, always leading deeper into the woods. That night, Sarah started sleepwalking. I'd wake to find her gone, the RV door hanging open like a mouth. I'd search frantically until I found her standing in some clearing, arms outstretched to the sky, muttering in what sounded like a language made of wind and whispers. When I'd shake her awake, she'd look at me with confusion, claiming she'd only stepped outside for air. But her feet were always dirty, always cut and bleeding from walking barefoot over sharp stones and thorns. On the second night, she brought something back with her. The bone circle. The thing Sarah found was no bigger than my thumb, a carved bone cylinder covered in the same spiral patterns from the journal. She'd clutched it in her fist while sleepwalking, her knuckles white with the effort of holding on. "Where did you get this?" I asked, examining the artifact in the morning light. It was warm to the touch and seemed to vibrate with its own subtle energy. "I don't remember," she said, but her eyes held a secretive gleam. "But I think it's important. I think it wants us to find the others." Others. The word sent a chill down my spine. That afternoon, against every instinct screaming in my head, I let her lead me deeper into the valley. The journal had become her obsession, and she'd deciphered enough of the text to understand its basic purpose. It was a guide. Instructions for something the writer called the awakening. We found the first bone circle in a grove of dead aspens, their white trunks standing like massive bones against the darkening sky. 23 carved cylinders arranged in a perfect spiral, each one humming with that same strange energy. Sarah moved among them like she'd been there before, her hands dancing over the artifacts with practiced familiarity. "Can you feel it?" she whispered, pressing one of the bones to her forehead. "They're singing. All of them, singing the same song. I couldn't hear anything but the wind through the skeletal branches. But something was definitely wrong with this place. The air felt thick, oppressive. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Sarah began arranging the bones in a new pattern, following diagrams from the journal. As she worked, her movements became more fluid, more purposeful, less human. "Sarah, stop." I grabbed her wrist. "We're leaving. Now." She looked at me with eyes that weren't quite the right color anymore. Still brown, but with flecks of gold that seemed to move and shift like living things. But we're so close, Marcus. Can't you see? This is why we came here. This is why I found the forum post. This is why—" She never finished the sentence. Something crashed through the trees behind us, and when we turned to look, the bone circle was gone. All 23 pieces had vanished, leaving only dark spots in the earth where they'd rested. But Sarah still held one in her hand. That night, she started changing. The transformation sleep became impossible. Every time I dozed off, I'd wake to find Sarah standing over me, that bone cylinder pressed against her lips like she was whispering secrets to it. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and dark veins had begun appearing beneath the surface, spreading up her arms like roots seeking sunlight. When I tried to talk to her about leaving, she'd smile that too-sharp smile and change the subject. She'd started eating raw meat, claiming she'd developed a sudden craving for rare steak, then graduating to chunks of bloody venison she claimed to have found already prepared near our campsite. But there were no other campers in Echo Valley. I'd hiked the entire perimeter. We were completely alone. The journal had revealed more of its secrets, and the story it told was horrifying. A Native American shaman named Twisted Wolf had discovered the valley in 1847, drawn by visions of power that promised to reunite him with his dead children. But the power he'd found wasn't what he'd expected. The entities that lived in the deep places beneath the mountains were ancient and hungry. They'd been sleeping since before humans walked the earth, dreaming of the day they could return to claim what had once been theirs. The bone artifacts were keys, and the ritual circles were doors. 23 keys to unlock 23 doors. Sarah had found 22 of them. I tried to destroy the journal, but every time I threw it in the fire, it would reappear on the table in the morning, unburned and somehow even more detailed than before. New pages kept appearing, written in Sarah's handwriting but describing events that hadn't happened yet. Events that were going to happen to me. According to the journal, the ritual required a willing sacrifice, someone who loved the vessel deeply enough to die for them. The transformation would be complete at the new moon, still 3 days away. Sarah would become something else, something that could carry the Ancient Ones back into the world, and I would feed the earth with my blood. The worst part wasn't the prophecy itself. It was the growing realization that part of Sarah, some deep buried part, was still in there, watching helplessly as something else wore her face and spoke with her voice. Sometimes, in unguarded moments, I'd catch her looking at me with desperate terror, her mouth forming the word "run" before the thing behind her eyes regained control. But I couldn't leave her. Not like this. The final night. The scratching at our door continued for hours, growing more insistent as the night wore on. Sarah sat cross-legged on our bed, the bone cylinder in her lap, humming a melody that made my teeth ache. Her fingernails had grown longer, darker, and her hair had begun falling out in clumps. "Marcus," she said without looking at me, "do you remember our wedding vows?" The question caught me off guard. Of course. For better or worse, in sickness and in health, her head turned toward me with a movement too fluid for human anatomy, rotating almost 180 degrees. "Till death do us part." The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear something else. Voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, chanting in that same inhuman language Sarah had been muttering in her sleep. They were coming from beneath us, rising up through the earth itself. "They're ready," Sarah whispered, and when she smiled, I saw that her teeth had been replaced by rows of needle-sharp points. "The doors are opening." The floor of our RV began to glow with pale, sickly light. The spiral patterns from the journal were appearing in the metal itself, etched by invisible hands. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and our breath began to mist. Through the walls, I could see shapes moving in the darkness. Tall, impossibly thin figures with too many joints. Their faces human, but wrong, like photographs that had been stretched and distorted. They stood in perfect circles around our RV, swaying to the rhythm of the chanting. 22 circles, 22 doors. Sarah stood up, her movements now completely inhuman, and walked to the center of the glowing floor. She held the bone cylinder above her head, and it began to pulse with its own inner light. "The 23rd door," she said in a voice that wasn't hers anymore. The final key. I understood then. The RV itself was the final circle. We'd parked it in exactly the right spot, guided by suggestion and manipulation I'd been too blind to see. Sarah hadn't found that forum post by accident. She'd been chosen, called to this place to serve as a vessel for something that had been waiting centuries for the stars to align properly. The bone cylinder was pulsing faster now, its light growing brighter. The chanting outside had reached a fever pitch, and the shapes were pressing closer to our windows, their faces eager and hungry. I had seconds to act. Grabbing the propane tank from our kitchenette, I twisted the valve fully open and sparked the igniter from our stove. The explosion that followed was small but sufficient, enough to shatter the bone cylinder and send Sarah flying backward, the thing wearing her face shrieking in a voice like breaking glass. The lights went out. The chanting stopped. The shapes outside melted back into the darkness like smoke. In the sudden quiet, I could hear Sarah crying, really crying with her own voice, human and broken and real. Marcus? She was herself again, at least for the moment. Blood was streaming from her nose and her eyes were back to their normal brown. What's happening to me? But even as she spoke, I could see the golden flecks returning to her irises. The transformation wasn't over. It was just paused. I helped her to her feet, knowing we had minutes at most before the thing took control again. The propane leak was making me dizzy, but I didn't dare turn it off. It was the only thing keeping the entities at bay. We have to leave, I told her. Right now. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I couldn't stop it. It's been in my head for days, showing me things, promising me things. I wanted to fight it, but it was so strong, and I was so tired. We stumbled outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The valley looked different now, smaller somehow and completely enclosed. The mountain passes we'd driven through to get here were gone, replaced by solid walls of stone. We were trapped in a bowl of granite with no way out, but at least we were together. Sarah's transformation was accelerating. Even as we stood there, her skin was growing paler, and those dark veins were spreading up her neck toward her face. She had maybe an hour left before the thing took permanent control. There's only one way, she said, her voice already taking on that inhuman quality. The journal mentioned it. A way to break the cycle. She pulled out the leather-bound book, its pages now glowing with the same pale light as the bone cylinder had. The text was shifting, rearranging itself into new patterns, new instructions. The vessel must choose, she read, love or power, life or transformation. The choice must be made freely, or the doors remain sealed. I understood. Sarah had to reject the transformation herself, completely and willingly. But that would mean losing the power the entities had shown her, the promises they'd made. She'd have to choose our mortal love over immortal strength. She looked at me with eyes that were now more gold than brown, her face a battleground between human emotion and alien hunger. "Help me remember," she whispered. "Help me remember why I should choose you, the choice." I told her about our first date, how she'd gotten food poisoning from bad sushi and I'd spent the night holding her hair back while she was sick, and she'd still insisted it was the most romantic evening of her life. I told her about the morning she'd surprised me with breakfast in bed for my birthday, except she'd burned the eggs and set off the smoke alarm, and we'd ended up eating cereal while the fire department checked our apartment. I told her about the night we'd gotten lost driving to her sister's wedding, and instead of being angry, she'd started singing off-key show tunes until I was laughing so hard I had to pull over. Small moments, human moments, imperfect and beautiful and real. With each memory, the gold in her eyes dimmed slightly. The dark veins began to recede. Her smile became less sharp, more familiar. But the entities weren't giving up without a fight. The ground beneath us began to crack, and things started crawling out. Chitinous, many-legged horrors that had been sleeping in the deep places for thousands of years. The air filled with the sound of wings and screams and alien languages that hurt to hear. Sarah was caught between two realities, her body flickering like a broken television signal. Sometimes she was my wife, tears streaming down her face as she fought to maintain control. Sometimes she was something else entirely, her limbs stretching and bending in impossible ways as she reached toward the crawling things with predatory hunger. "The power," she gasped, her voice switching between human and inhuman with each word. "They're showing me the power. I could live forever. I could know everything. You could lose yourself completely," I interrupted. "Is that what you want? To become something that wears your face but isn't you anymore?" The creatures were getting closer, forming their own circles around us. In the distance, I could see the mountains themselves beginning to move, shifting and rearranging like the pieces of some massive geological puzzle. Sarah closed her eyes, her whole body trembling with the effort of choosing between two impossible realities. "I love you," she whispered, and for a moment she was completely herself again. "I love you more than power, more than immortality, more than knowing everything." She opened her eyes, and they were brown again, completely, beautifully brown. The entities shrieked in unison, a sound that shattered the windows of our RV and sent the crawling things scurrying back into their holes. The mountains stopped moving. The cracks in the earth sealed themselves. But the journal burst into flames in her hands, and as it burned, I could see the knowledge it contained flowing out of her like water from a broken dam. The alien languages, the arcane symbols, the locations of the other bone circles, all of it disappearing, leaving her human and finite and perfect. She collapsed into my arms, completely herself again but utterly exhausted. The golden flecks were gone from her eyes and the dark veins had faded to nothing. She was just Sarah again. My Sarah, flawed and mortal and real. Around us, Echo Valley was already changing back. The mountain passes were reappearing, and in the growing dawn light I could see the road that would take us home. Epilogue. 6 months later. We never talked about what happened in the Wallowa Mountains. Not to friends, not to family, not even to each other. Some experiences are too vast, too alien, to squeeze into the narrow confines of human language. But Sarah was different afterward. Not in any way others would notice. She still burned eggs and sang off-key and made terrible jokes at inappropriate moments. But sometimes, usually late at night when she thought I was asleep, I'd catch her staring out the window with an expression of profound loss. She'd given up something immense to choose our small, human love. Part of her would always wonder what she might have become, what knowledge she might have possessed, what power she might have wielded. But she'd chosen us. Chosen mortality and uncertainty and the messy, imperfect beauty of being human. I found the forum post she'd used to find Echo Valley. It was gone now, deleted, as if it had never existed. But sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd search for it anyway, just to make sure it stayed gone. Because sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I could swear I heard something calling from the mountains. Something that remembered her voice and wanted her back. Something that knew exactly where we lived. The scratching at our bedroom window started again last Tuesday, always at 3:17 a.m. Sarah says it's just tree branches in the wind, and maybe she's right, but I've been checking the locks more carefully lately, and I've been having dreams about spirals carved into living wood, about doors that open onto places that shouldn't exist, about tall figures with too many joints standing in perfect circles around our house. The entities in Echo Valley had been sleeping for centuries before we found them. I have to believe they'll sleep for centuries more. But sometimes when Sarah smiles at me across the breakfast table, I catch a glimpse of gold in her brown eyes. Just for a second, just long enough to remind me that some choices can be unmade if you want them badly enough. And late at night, when the scratching stops and the house grows quiet, I wonder if she's starting to remember what she gave up. I wonder if she's starting to regret her choice. I wonder if next time, when they call her name, she'll answer. The bone cylinder we never found, the 23rd key, is still out there somewhere in the mountains, waiting for someone else to pick it up, someone else to carry it home, someone else to open the final door. But that's not our story anymore. At least, I hope it isn't. Because if I'm wrong, if Sarah is slowly changing back into something else, then this isn't the end of our ordeal in the Wallowa Mountains. It's just the beginning. I never believed in the stories they told about the Deschutes National Forest, until what happened to me out there. My name is Rachel Morrison, I'm 33 years old, and what I lived through during that weekend still wakes me up at night. The hunger started on day 2, and it wasn't normal. I woke up in our 32-foot Winnebago feeling like I hadn't eaten in weeks, despite having a full dinner the night before. My stomach wasn't just empty. It was consuming itself, cramping with a desperate primal need that made my hands shake and my vision blur. Beside me, my girlfriend Sophia was making soft, whimpering sounds in her sleep, her face contorted with what looked like pain. When I shook her awake, she immediately clutched her abdomen. "God, I'm starving," she gasped. "I feel like I'm dying." We'd been camping in Oregon's remote Deschutes National Forest for less than 48 hours, parked in a secluded clearing near the Metolius River that Sophia had found on some obscure wilderness forum. The spot was perfect, completely isolated, surrounded by towering ponderosa pines with a crystal-clear stream running along one edge of the campsite. Too perfect, I was beginning to realize. I stumbled to our kitchenette and pulled out food, everything we had. Granola bars, trail mix, leftover pasta from dinner. My body was screaming for sustenance, but as soon as I took a bite, I felt violently ill. The food tasted like ash and metal, and my throat closed up like my body was rejecting nourishment itself. Sophia tried eating too, with the same result. We were starving, but couldn't keep food down. "Maybe it's altitude sickness," Sophia suggested, though we were only at about 3,000 feet elevation. Or food poisoning from that restaurant in Bend. But even as we tried to rationalize it, I knew this was something else. The hunger wasn't just physical, it was psychological, emotional, like a void opening inside me that food couldn't fill. When I looked at Sophia, really looked at her, I felt something that terrified me. For just a moment, she didn't look like my girlfriend of 2 years. She looked like meat. The thought came unbidden, alien, horrifying. I pushed it away, but it lingered at the edges of my mind like a whisper I couldn't unhear. "Rachel." Sophia was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Calculating, predatory. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" I wanted to ask what she meant, but I was afraid I already knew. We'd driven deep into the Deschutes forest following a road that seemed to disappear from our GPS after we'd committed to it. No cell service, no other campers, no rangers. Just us and thousands of acres of wilderness. And something was making us hungry for things food couldn't satisfy. Day 3. The drawings. The hunger was worse on the 3rd morning, accompanied by strange dreams I couldn't quite remember. Images of running through dark forests, of hunting something that screamed in a human voice, of feeding on warm flesh that tasted like the most delicious meal I'd ever eaten. I woke with the taste still in my mouth. Rich, satisfying, real. Sophia was already up, standing at the window looking out at the forest with an intensity that made me nervous. Her body language was different, more alert, more predatory. When she turned to face me, her pupils were dilated despite the bright morning light. "I found something," she said, her voice carrying a strange excitement. "While you were sleeping, look." She led me outside to a large ponderosa pine about 50 feet from our RV. Carved into the bark about 8 feet up were symbols I'd never seen before. Not quite letters, not quite pictures, spiraling, organic shapes that seemed to writhe when I looked at them directly. "These weren't here yesterday," I said. "No, they appeared overnight." Sophia traced one of the symbols with her finger, and I saw that her fingernails had grown longer, sharper. "I think they're instructions." "Instructions for what?" She smiled, and her teeth looked different. Whiter, more pointed. "For feeding." The word sent a chill through me, but also a terrible excitement. My stomach cramped again, that desperate emptiness that regular food couldn't touch. "Sophia, you're scaring me." "Am I? Or are you finally starting to understand what this place wants from us?" I looked around our campsite and noticed things I'd somehow missed before. The fire ring wasn't made of collected stones. It was built from what looked like carved bone. The clearing was perfectly circular, too geometric to be natural. And there were paths leading into the forest, worn smooth by countless feet, though we'd seen no other campers. Most disturbing were the trees themselves. Looking closely, I could see that many of them bore similar carvings to the fresh ones Sophia had found. Some looked ancient, others more recent. The forest was covered in these symbols, layer upon layer of messages in a language that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to something primal in my brain. "How many people do you think have camped here?" I asked. "All the ones who were supposed to," Sophia replied cryptically. "All the ones who answered the call." I was about to ask what she meant when I heard voices coming from the forest. Multiple people, talking and laughing, their conversation carrying clearly through the trees. Relief flooded through me. Other campers, people who could help us figure out what was wrong, maybe give us a ride back to civilization. But as the voices grew closer, I began to pick out individual words, and my relief curdled into horror. "Tastes better when they run first. The fear makes the meat tender. Save the organs for last, they're the sweetest part." The voices were discussing cannibalism with the casual tone of people planning a barbecue. Sophia grabbed my arm, her grip strong enough to bruise. "Do you hear that? They understand. They know how to feed the hunger. We need to leave. Right now." But even as I said it, I knew we couldn't. Our truck wouldn't start. I discovered that yesterday when the hunger first hit. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, and no amount of troubleshooting could identify the problem. We were trapped here with whatever was making us think these horrible thoughts. The voices were getting closer, and through the trees I could see shapes moving. Human figures, but wrong, somehow. They moved with an unnatural gait, too fluid, too coordinated, like predators who'd learned to walk upright. "Hide," I hissed, pulling Sophia toward our RV. But she resisted, her eyes fixed on the approaching figures with fascination rather than fear. "Why hide? They're like us now. They understand the hunger." One of the figures stepped into our clearing and my breath caught. It looked human at first glance, a middle-aged man in hiking clothes, smiling and friendly. But his smile was too wide, revealing too many teeth, and his eyes held an intelligence that felt alien. "Hello, neighbors," he said, his voice perfectly normal except for a slight echo, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? Perfect weather for hunting." Behind him, more figures emerged from the tree line. Men and women of various ages, all with that same too-wide smile and those wrong eyes. They arranged themselves in a loose circle around our campsite, their movements synchronized like a pack of wolves. "We've been watching you," a woman said, her voice carrying the same hollow echo. "Waiting for the hunger to take hold. It's different for everyone. Some take days, others weeks, but it always wins in the end." Sophia stepped forward, and I could see her body language shifting, becoming more like theirs, that fluid, predatory grace. "How long?" she asked. "I came here in 1987, the man replied. "Sarah here has been feeding since the early 2000s. The forest calls to those who are ready, who can appreciate its gifts." "Gifts?" I managed to ask, though part of me already understood. "The hunger is a gift," Sarah explained. "It frees you from the limitations of civilized morality. It shows you what humans really are underneath all the social conditioning." She gestured to the symbols carved in the trees. "Every mark is a feast. Every symbol represents someone who answered the call and stayed to feed. The forest preserves us, sustains us, as long as we honor its needs." "You're cannibals," I said, the word tasting like poison. The circle of figures laughed in perfect unison, a sound like breaking glass. "We're evolved," the man corrected. "We've moved beyond the arbitrary restrictions that keep most humans weak and hungry. The forest showed us the truth, that the greatest taboo is also the greatest pleasure." Sophia was nodding along, her expression rapt. "I can feel it," she whispered. "The hunger isn't for food, it's for more." "Exactly." Sarah's smile widened impossibly further. "Food is just dead matter. But when you feed on living flesh, on fear and pain, and the final moments of consciousness, that's when you truly taste life. I backed toward our RV, but the circle closed around me. Up close, I could see that these things were no longer entirely human. Their skin had a waxy, preserved quality. Their movements were too precise, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. And their eyes reflected light like nocturnal predators. "The forest preserves us," the man explained, noticing my stare. "As long as we feed it regularly, it keeps us young, strong, free from the decay that claims ordinary humans. Some of us have been hunting these woods for decades." Hunting what? Campers, hikers, people who answer the call and come to feed, whether they understand it or not. Sarah gestured to our RV. "Like you did." I realized then that we hadn't found this place by accident. The forum post Sophia had seen, the road that led here, the perfect isolation. It was all designed to lure specific people who were susceptible to whatever influence this place exerted. "Sophia," I said, trying to reach whatever remained of my girlfriend. "Fight it. This isn't you." But when she turned to look at me, I saw that the transformation was already well advanced. Her eyes now reflected light like the others, and when she smiled, her teeth had grown into sharp, carnivorous points. "But it is me," she said. "It's the real me, finally free to express what I've always wanted but never dared to acknowledge." The circle began to close, and I could see the anticipation in their faces. They'd done this before, many times, judging by the countless symbols carved into the trees. "Don't worry," the man said gently. "The fear only lasts a few minutes. After that, you'll understand. You'll see why we chose this life over the pale shadow most humans call existence." I ran. The hunt. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin as I fled deeper into the forest. Behind me, I could hear them following, not running, but moving with the patient confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to go. Their voices carried through the trees, calling to me with mockery and false comfort. "Rachel, come back. The hunger will only get worse if you fight it. You can't escape what you're becoming. The forest has already claimed you. Why suffer needlessly?" But worst of all was Sophia's voice, pleading with a tone that almost sounded like my girlfriend. "Rachel, please, I need you. Don't leave me with these monsters." I wanted to believe she was fighting the influence, but I'd seen her eyes. Whatever had taken hold of her was too strong to resist, and pretending otherwise would only get me killed. The forest seemed to shift around me as I ran, paths appearing and disappearing, familiar landmarks vanishing and reappearing in impossible locations. I was being herded, driven toward some destination I couldn't see but could sense waiting ahead. The symbols were everywhere now, carved into every tree, scratched into fallen logs, even formed by the arrangement of stones and fallen branches. The entire forest was one massive ritual site, marked by decades of human sacrifice. I stumbled into a clearing and found myself face to face with the evidence of what happened to people who came here. Scattered throughout the space were bones, human bones, picked clean and arranged in careful patterns. Skulls formed the points of a massive star, with ribs and femurs creating the connecting lines. At the center sat a throne made of fused human spines, and on it, the thing on the throne had once been human, but that was centuries ago. Its body was a patchwork of preserved flesh from different people, sewn together with sinews and held in place by what looked like tree roots growing through its skin. Its face was a collection of features from dozens of different people. Eyes of different colors, mismatched teeth, patches of skin in varying shades. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus of everyone it had consumed. "Welcome, Rachel Morrison, age 33, from Portland, Oregon. Marketing coordinator, yoga enthusiast, recently promoted at her advertising firm. You answered the call beautifully. The thing knew me. It knew details about my life I'd never shared with anyone. The hunger you feel is my hunger," it continued. "I am what the forest creates when enough flesh has been offered. I am the gestalt consciousness of every person who has fed here. Their experiences and desires merged into something greater than human. Around the clearing, I could see my pursuers emerging from the trees. The circle of cannibals, and among them, Sophia. But her transformation was accelerating. Her proportions were changing, becoming more like the thing on the throne. Sophia fought it longer than most, the creature observed, but the hunger always wins. It's written into the deep programming of human consciousness, the urge to consume, to absorb, to become more by taking from others. "You're insane," I said, backing toward what looked like a trail leading out of the clearing. "Sanity is a cage," the thing replied. "I offer freedom. Freedom from mortality, from the constant fear of death, from the endless struggle to maintain individual identity. Join us and become part of something eternal." The trail behind me suddenly filled with more of them. Campers and hikers from different decades, their clothing styles spanning generations, but all sharing the same predatory grace and reflective eyes. I was surrounded, trapped in a clearing full of human bones with nowhere left to run. "The process is actually quite pleasant," Sarah explained, moving closer with slow, deliberate steps. "The fear gives way to understanding, then to gratitude. You'll see your old self as a chrysalis, and this as your true metamorphosis. Sophia," I tried one last time, "remember who you were. Remember us." For just a moment, something flickered in her eyes, a glimpse of the woman I'd fallen in love with. Her face contorted with internal struggle, and when she spoke, her voice was her own. "Run, Rachel. Run now, while you still can." Then the moment passed, and she was lost again. But her brief return to herself had created a gap in their circle. I dove through it, crashing into the forest beyond the clearing just as their coordinated movement broke down into chaos. Behind me, I could hear the thing on the throne roaring in frustration, its chorus of voices screaming in unison. "Find her! The forest must feed!" The escape attempt. I ran through the dark forest for what felt like hours, guided only by moonlight and the desperate need to get away from the nightmare behind me. The symbols on the trees seemed to glow with their own pale light, creating a maze of phosphorescent markers that led me deeper into the woods rather than toward any exit. Every time I thought I was making progress toward the edge of the forest, I'd find myself back at familiar landmarks. The same distinctive rock formation, the same fallen log, the same grove of birch trees with their pale bark gleaming in the darkness. The forest was a trap, as carefully designed as a spider's web, but as I ran, I began to notice something the cannibals hadn't mentioned. The hunger that had been gnawing at me for days was starting to change. Instead of the desperate craving for flesh, I felt a different kind of emptiness, a hollow ache where my memories of Sophia should be. I could remember that we'd come here together, could recall the basic facts of our relationship, but the emotional connection was fading. The love I'd felt for her, the shared experiences that had bonded us together, the intimate moments that made her uniquely precious to me. All of it was being consumed by the same force that created the physical hunger. The forest wasn't just trying to make me a cannibal. It was erasing my capacity for human connection, hollowing out everything that made me who I am and replacing it with pure, insatiable appetite. I stopped running and pressed my back against a massive Douglas fir, trying to catch my breath and think. The carvings in this tree were deeper and more elaborate than the others, forming an intricate pattern that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. As I studied the symbols, knowledge flooded into my mind. Not my own thoughts, but information being transmitted directly into my consciousness. I understood now what this place really was. The Deschutes forest contained what the original Native American inhabitants had called a hunger spirit, an entity that fed on human consciousness itself. It didn't just want flesh. It wanted souls, experiences, the accumulated weight of human lives. Every person who disappeared here didn't just die. They were absorbed, their memories and personalities becoming part of the collective consciousness that ruled this place. The cannibals I'd encountered weren't just people who'd been corrupted. They were puppet bodies animated by fragments of the hunger spirit, each one containing dozens of consumed personalities. And the throned creature was the center of it all. a grotesque amalgamation of everyone who'd ever fed the forest. It was growing larger, more complex, more intelligent with each new victim. I was supposed to be the next addition to its collection, but understanding the trap gave me an idea. If the forest fed on consciousness, on memory, and emotion, then maybe I could use that hunger against it. I pulled out my phone, grateful that I'd put it in airplane mode to save battery. The camera still worked, and I began documenting everything. The symbols on the trees, the bone arrangements I'd seen in the clearing, the impossible geography that kept leading me in circles. As I recorded, I focused on preserving not just the visual information, but the emotional context. My fear, my love for Sophia, my determination to survive and warn others about this place. I poured my entire consciousness into that digital record, creating a repository of human experience that existed outside the forest's influence. The trees around me began to rustle with agitation as if the forest could sense what I was doing. The symbols on the bark started glowing brighter, and I could feel the hungry presence pressing against my mind, trying to pull those emotions and memories out of me before I could encode them. But I held on, narrating everything I'd learned into the phone's microphone while walking steadily in what I hoped was the direction of the road. "My name is Rachel Morrison," I said, fighting against the mental pressure trying to silence me. "If you find this recording, do not come to the coordinates I'm about to give you. The Deschutes Forest contains something that feeds on human consciousness. It creates an artificial hunger that makes people crave flesh, but that's just the first step in a process that ultimately consumes their souls." The pressure in my mind intensified, and I could feel my memories of Sophia fading faster. But I kept talking, using my voice as an anchor to maintain my sense of self. The forest preserves the bodies of its victims, but uses them as vessels for a collective consciousness. Every person who disappears here becomes part of something larger and more terrible. The cannibalism is just a side effect. The real horror is losing yourself piece by piece until nothing remains but hunger. Around me, the trees were bending inward, their branches reaching like grasping fingers. The symbols on their bark had grown so bright they cast shadows, and in those shadows I could see faces. All the people who'd been consumed by this place, their features distorted by anguish and desperate recognition. They were trying to warn me, these trapped souls, but they could only communicate through the forest that had devoured them. I kept walking, kept recording, and gradually the oppressive presence began to weaken. The symbols grew dimmer, the trees straightened, and the impossible geography started to make sense again. I was almost free. The road home. I found our truck at dawn, sitting exactly where we'd left it 3 days ago. But the campsite was different. Not destroyed or abandoned, but carefully reset. Our RV was gone, replaced by empty space so seamless it looked like nothing had ever been there. The forest had erased all evidence of our presence, except for me. The truck started immediately, its engine purring with perfect reliability. Whatever had been preventing our escape was no longer in effect. I drove out of the forest as fast as the winding dirt roads would allow, not stopping until I reached the main highway. My phone had signal again, and the recording was still there. 5 hours of documentation that proved what I'd experienced was real. But when I tried to call the authorities, I discovered something that chilled me more than anything I'd encountered in the forest. There was no record of Sophia Chen ever existing. No driver's license, no social media profiles, no employment history. The apartment we'd shared was listed as a single-occupancy rental in my name only. Our mutual friends had no memory of her, and when I showed them photos, they looked at me with the kind of concern reserved for people having mental breakdowns. According to every official record and human memory except my own, I'd taken this camping trip alone. The forest hadn't just consumed Sophia. It had erased her from reality itself, editing the timeline to remove any trace of her existence. I was the only person left who remembered her, and even those memories were fading, being slowly digested by whatever fragment of the hunger spirit had followed me home. I tried to hold on to her, to keep her alive through sheer force of will, but it was like trying to remember a dream after waking. The details slipped away no matter how tightly I grasped them. Within a week, I could barely recall her face. Within a month, I wasn't sure if she'd ever been real at all. But the recording remained, and in it, I could hear my own voice describing someone I loved. Someone who'd been taken from me so completely that reality itself had forgotten her existence. Epilogue. 6 months later. I never returned to the Deschutes forest, but sometimes it calls to me in dreams. I wake with the taste of flesh in my mouth and a gnawing emptiness that food can't satisfy, and I know that the hunger spirit hasn't finished with me yet. The recording I made has been downloaded thousands of times from the various forums where I've posted it, but most people dismiss it as an elaborate work of fiction. Those who believe it exists tend to be the kind of people who would be susceptible to the forest's call. Isolated, desperate, looking for something to fill the void in their lives. I've tried to warn them away, but part of me wonders if I'm actually serving the forest's interests by spreading awareness of its existence. Every person who searches for that hidden campsite is a potential victim, and the hunger spirit is patient enough to wait for the right prey to arrive. Sometimes I receive emails from people who found similar places, remote wilderness areas where campers disappear and the few survivors return changed, hollow, missing pieces of themselves they can't even remember losing. The phenomenon is spreading. Or maybe it was always there and I've simply become aware of it. I've started having blackouts again, waking up in places I don't remember going with dirt under my fingernails and the taste of copper in my mouth. My apartment's refrigerator is always full of meat I don't remember buying, and lately I've been having trouble keeping regular food down. The hunger is coming back, and this time there's no Sophia to anchor me to my humanity. I think the forest is calling me home. Last night I found myself researching routes back to the Deschutes forest, plotting out the fastest way to return to that hidden campsite. The urge is getting stronger, and I'm not sure how much longer I can resist it. Because the truth is, I'm starting to remember what human flesh tastes like, and it's the most delicious thing I've ever experienced. If you find this account and decide to look for the place I've described, please remember, the hunger isn't punishment. It's evolution. The forest is offering something most humans are too weak to accept. Freedom from the burden of individual consciousness, the peace that comes with being part of something larger than yourself. When you feel that first gnawing emptiness in your stomach, don't fight it. Embrace it. Let it guide you to the truth about what humans really are beneath all the social conditioning and arbitrary moral restrictions. The forest is waiting for you. It's waiting for all of us. And when you finally answer its call, you'll understand why I can't stop thinking about going back. The recording ends here, but the story continues in the dreams of everyone who hears it, planting seeds of hunger that will eventually bloom into something beautiful and terrible. See you in the forest. Sometimes I wonder if it followed me home from Silver Falls State Park. I'm Marcus Webb, and I was 35 when I learned that some things in the woods aren't meant to be found. The first sign something was wrong came when I aged 10 years in 3 days. I woke up in our 29-foot Airstream on what should have been Thursday morning, but when I looked in the bathroom mirror, I saw a stranger. Deep lines around my eyes that hadn't been there on Monday. Gray streaks in my hair that had been solid brown when we'd arrived at Silver Falls State Park. My hands looked weathered, aged, like I'd been doing manual labor for decades. My wife, Linda, was still asleep, and when I gently shook her shoulder, she opened eyes that belonged on a much older woman. Her face had aged at least 15 years overnight. Crow's feet, worry lines, a sag to her skin that spoke of decades I couldn't remember living. "Marcus?" Her voice was raspier than before, carrying the weight of years we'd never experienced. "What's happening to us?" I checked my phone. According to the timestamp, it was Thursday, September 15th, just 3 days since we'd arrived in Oregon. But according to the camera's metadata, the photos from our first day showed people who looked 20 years older than us. We'd been documenting our trip obsessively. Linda was a travel blogger who specialized in off-the-beaten-path camping destinations. Her laptop contained hundreds of photos and videos from our stay at Silver Falls, but they told a story that didn't match our memories. In the earliest photos, we looked normal, a couple in our mid-30s enjoying a romantic getaway. But as the timestamps progressed, we aged rapidly. Day by day, hour by hour, the changes accelerated. By the most recent images, we looked like we were pushing 60. But the most disturbing part wasn't how we looked. It was what we were doing in the photos. Images of us hiking trails that didn't exist on any park map. Videos of us setting up camp in locations that weren't part of the official campground. Pictures of us with other campers, elderly couples, families with grown children, groups of friends who all looked decades older than they should have. And in every photo, everyone was smiling. Not normal, happy smiles, but expressions of vacant contentment, like people who'd forgotten they had anything to worry about. "Look at this," Linda said, pointing to a video file dated yesterday. In it, we were sitting around a campfire with a group of strangers, all of us visibly aged but talking and laughing like old friends. The conversation was normal, discussing hiking routes, sharing camping tips, trading stories about our travels. But none of us remembered meeting these people. "Who are they?" I asked, studying the faces around the fire. "And why do we look so comfortable with them?" Linda fast-forwarded through the video, and I watched our aged selves interacting with these strangers like we'd known them for years. At one point, the older version of me was showing them something on a map, pointing to locations and nodding knowingly. "Marcus, look at the background," Linda whispered. Behind our little campfire gathering, barely visible in the darkness, were more groups. Dozens of them, scattered throughout what should have been empty forest. All sitting around fires, all filled with people who looked much older than they should be, all wearing those same expressions of vacant contentment. We weren't alone in the woods. We were part of something much larger. I grabbed our camping gear and started packing frantically. "We're leaving, right now." But when I tried to start our pickup truck, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't turn over, the electrical system was dead, and the battery showed full charge. Linda tried her cell phone. No signal, which had been normal for this remote area, but now felt ominous. We were stranded in a place that was stealing our years. While Linda continued going through our photos, looking for clues about what had happened to us, I decided to explore the campground. Maybe we could find someone who could help, or at least explain what was happening. Silver Falls State Park was famous for its hiking trails that led behind numerous waterfalls, but our campsite was in a remote section I didn't remember from the park brochures. The sites around us were occupied by other RVs and tents, but something felt wrong about them. All the vehicles looked older than they should be. Not vintage or classic cars, but modern vehicles that had somehow accumulated decades of wear in a short time. A Honda Civic that should have been maybe 5 years old showed rust patterns and fading that spoke of much longer exposure to the elements. The people I encountered were even more unsettling. Everyone looked prematurely aged, but they moved and talked like they didn't notice or care. A woman who couldn't have been more than 40 when she arrived was hanging laundry with the careful movements of someone in their 70s. But she hummed cheerfully as she worked. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" she called out when she saw me. "How long have you been camping here?" I asked. She paused, a confused frown crossing her weathered face. Well, we just arrived yesterday. Or was it the day before?" She laughed, but the sound was hollow. "Time moves differently here. So peaceful, you lose track. Don't you want to go home?" The frown deepened, and for a moment, genuine distress flickered in her eyes. "Home? We were going home after the weekend, but it's been such a lovely time. Why rush?" She returned to hanging laundry, and I noticed her hands were shaking. I approached several more campers and got similar responses. Everyone remembered arriving recently, but none of them could give me a clear timeline. They all spoke about leaving soon or after the weekend, but couldn't explain why they were still here. Most disturbing was a family with 2 teenagers. The parents looked elderly, and the kids, who should have been in their late teens, had the appearance of people in their 30s. But they all interacted like a normal family, apparently oblivious to the physical impossibility of their situation. "Dad, can we hike to the falls again today?" the older teenager asked, his voice carrying the depth of a middle-aged man. "Of course, son. We have plenty of time." I wanted to shake them, to make them see what was happening, but their contentment seemed unshakable. Whatever process was aging them was also affecting their perception of time and reality. When I returned to our airstream, Linda had made a disturbing discovery. "Look at this," she said, showing me her laptop screen. She'd been going through our digital records, credit card statements, GPS tracking data, anything that might tell us how long we'd really been here. According to our bank records, we'd been making purchases at the Silver Falls camp store for 3 months. Gas, food, camping supplies, a steady stream of transactions that should have been impossible since we'd only brought cash for a weekend trip. But the purchases were there, documented in black and white, and the amounts suggested we'd been buying food for a much larger group than just the 2 of us. "Marcus, according to this, we've spent over $8,000 on supplies. Look at the quantities: 50 pounds of flour, cases of canned goods, enough food to feed an army." The GPS data from our phones was even more confusing. It showed us traveling throughout the Pacific Northwest over the past 3 months, visiting dozens of remote locations. But according to our memories, we'd driven straight from Portland to Silver Falls 3 days ago. "It's like we've been living a whole other life," Linda said. "A life we can't remember." I studied the GPS tracks more closely. The pattern was disturbing. We'd visited remote camping areas throughout Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, spending weeks at each location before moving on. Always off-the-grid places, always areas known for disappearances or strange phenomena. We're not the first, I realized. Look at these other locations. I bet if we researched them, we'd find similar stories. Places where time moves differently. Linda's face went pale. "Marcus, what if we're not victims? What if we're recruiting?" The idea hit me like ice water. What if the contentment I'd seen in the other campers wasn't just a side effect of the aging process? What if it was the point? What if we'd been traveling from place to place, drawing other people into whatever this phenomenon was? The photos on Linda's laptop suddenly took on a more sinister meaning. All those interactions with other aged campers, all that casual friendliness, were we building a network, creating a community of people trapped in accelerated time? "We need to find a way out of here," Linda said, "before we forget why we wanted to leave." But even as she said it, I could feel the contentment creeping in. The urgency that had driven me to pack our belongings was fading, replaced by a peaceful acceptance of our situation. The idea of leaving Silver Falls was starting to feel unnecessary. After all, we were having such a lovely time. Fighting against the growing complacency, I forced myself to hike deeper into the park, looking for answers. The official trails were well maintained and clearly marked, but I found myself drawn to less obvious paths, game trails and old logging roads that led away from the main attractions. The forest around Silver Falls was ancient, filled with towering Douglas firs and big-leaf maples that had stood for centuries. But as I hiked deeper, I began to notice trees that looked wrong. Not diseased or damaged, but somehow unstuck in time. Some ancient giants showed rings of different seasons simultaneously. Spring buds, summer leaves, autumn colors, and winter bareness all present on different branches of the same tree. Others seemed to flicker between different stages of growth. Saplings becoming mature trees becoming dead snags in the space of seconds before cycling back. The deeper I went, the more reality seemed to fracture around me. I found a clearing where multiple versions of the same stream flowed in different directions, past, present, and future watercourses occupying the same space. In one, the water ran clear and cold. In another, it was thick with sediment from some long-ago flood. In the third, the streambed was dry, showing a future drought that hadn't happened yet. And scattered throughout the clearing were campsites from different eras. I could see the ghostly outlines of Native American dwellings, their smoke still rising from fires that had burned centuries ago. Overlapping them were the remains of pioneer camps, with covered wagons and cooking gear from the 1800s. Modern tents and RVs flickered in and out of existence, representing campers from across decades. All of them occupied the same physical space, separated only by time. At the center of the clearing was what looked like a natural pool, fed by one of the impossible streams. But the water in the pool wasn't water. It was something that moved like liquid mercury but gleamed with colors that had no names. And reflected in its surface were faces, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. People of all ages and from all eras, their expressions showing the same vacant contentment I'd seen in the other campers. They were moving, talking, living their lives, but trapped in a reflection that existed outside normal time. I recognized some of the faces from the photos on Linda's laptop. As I stared into the pool, one of the reflections looked back at me. It was myself, but aged even further. An elderly version with white hair and deeply lined skin. He smiled and waved, then pointed to something behind me. I turned and saw Linda approaching through the trees, but she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by dozens of other campers, all of them aged beyond their years, all of them wearing those same peaceful expressions. "Marcus," she called out, her voice warm and welcoming. "Come join us. We've been waiting for you." But it wasn't really Linda anymore. The Linda I'd married was still in there somewhere, but she was being subsumed by something else. A collective consciousness that valued peace over individuality, contentment over growth. "We understand now," she continued, stepping closer to the pool. "This place doesn't steal time. It preserves it. Everyone who's ever camped here, everyone who's ever found peace in these woods, they're all still here, still experiencing that perfect moment of wilderness tranquility." The other campers nodded in agreement, their aged faces radiating serenity. "You can feel it, can't you?" asked the elderly woman I'd met earlier. "The weight of years, the accumulated wisdom. We're not losing time. We're gaining perspective, living full lives in compressed experience." I could feel the pull of their contentment, the appeal of simply accepting this impossible situation and joining their timeless community. Part of me wanted nothing more than to step into that pool and let myself be absorbed into whatever collective existence they'd found. But another part, a small, stubborn part that still remembered who I'd been before coming here, recognized this for what it was. "You're not living," I said. "You're just existing, experiencing the same peaceful moment over and over while your bodies age and your real lives slip away." The collective smiled at me with Linda's face. "What's wrong with peace, Marcus? What's wrong with contentment? The outside world offers nothing but stress, conflict, the constant pressure to achieve and accumulate and compete. Here, we found something better. But it's not real. It's a prison disguised as paradise. Reality is what we make it," Linda's voice said through lips that were no longer quite hers. "And we've made ours perfect." She stepped into the pool, and I watched in horror as she began to dissolve. Not dying, but dispersing into the collective of reflected faces. Her individual identity scattered like ripples on the surface, becoming part of something larger and less human. The other campers were stepping forward, inviting me to join them. Their hands reached out with gentle insistence, and I could feel the psychological pressure building. It would be so easy to let go, so simple to accept the peace they offered and forget about the world beyond these woods. But I thought about the people in the photos, all the other locations we'd apparently visited, all the other communities we'd helped establish. This wasn't just about Silver Falls. It was about something spreading, growing, consuming more and more people who just wanted to escape from the complications of modern life. I ran. I crashed through the forest, guided by pure instinct and the desperate need to get away from the time pool and its collective of contented prisoners. Behind me, I could hear them following, not running, but walking with the patient confidence of people who had all the time in the world. Because they did. In their fractured reality, time was negotiable, and they could afford to pursue me at their own pace. But as I ran, I began to notice that the temporal distortions were stronger in some areas than others. The trees that flickered between seasons, the overlapping campsites, the impossible streams, they were all concentrated around certain locations. The phenomenon had epicenters, focal points where reality broke down more completely, which meant there might be areas where it was weaker. I found myself at the famous South Falls, one of the park's main attractions where visitors could walk behind the waterfall itself. But this wasn't the tourist-friendly trail I expected. This was something much older and more primal. The waterfall was falling upward and downward simultaneously, the water existing in multiple temporal states at once. Some drops fell normally, others hung suspended in midair, and still others flowed backward toward the cliff above. But at the edges of the falls, where the temporal distortion was weakest, I could see glimpses of the normal world. Tourists walking the regular trail, families taking photos, park rangers giving guided tours, all existing in proper time, unaware of the fractured reality just a few feet away. If I could reach that normal zone, maybe I could escape. The problem was getting there. The path to the stable area led directly through the heart of the temporal distortion, and I could see the dangers waiting there. Multiple versions of the same people occupied the space. Tourists from different decades all visiting the falls at once, their timelines overlapping in impossible ways. A family from the 1950s shared the viewing area with hikers from the 2010s, both groups equally real but existing in different temporal frames. And scattered among them were the aged campers from the deeper woods, moving through the crowds like shepherds tending their flock. They were recruiting, I realized, identifying people who seemed dissatisfied or stressed and guiding them toward the trails that led to the time pools. I watched in horror as a modern couple, arguing about work and money, were approached by one of the aged figures. Within minutes, the temporal shepherd had convinced them to explore a hidden trail that would lead to real peace and quiet. They followed willingly, and I knew they'd never make it back to their regular lives. I had to time my approach carefully, waiting for a moment when the temporal distortion aligned in my favor. The waterfall shifted, the overlapping timeline separated slightly, and I saw my chance. I sprinted through the chaos of intersecting realities, dodging between temporal echoes of other visitors, ignoring the calls of the aged shepherds who tried to intercept me. For a terrifying moment, I felt myself being pulled into multiple time streams at once. I experienced flashes of different eras, the falls as they existed in pristine wilderness before human contact, the early days of the park's development, possible futures where the temporal fracture had consumed the entire region. But I kept running, focusing on the stable zone ahead where normal time still flowed properly. I reached the tourist trail and felt the relief of chronological consistency. Around me, families and hikers continued their normal visits, completely unaware of the temporal nightmare existing just yards away. My phone suddenly showed full signal strength and I checked the timestamp. According to the device, I'd been at Silver Falls for exactly 3 days, not the months suggested by our financial records. But when I looked at my reflection in the phone's camera, I still saw the aged face that had stared back at me from the Airstream's mirror. Some effects of the temporal distortion were permanent. I made it back to our campsite to find our truck mysteriously functional again. The engine started immediately, all systems working perfectly. But Linda was gone, and so were all our belongings except for her laptop. On the screen was a message, written in her handwriting but not her words. The network grows. Each location feeds the others. Each community strengthens the whole. Thank you for your contribution to something beautiful. Attached were files containing detailed information about dozens of similar sites across the Pacific Northwest, remote camping areas where time moved differently, where people aged rapidly while experiencing perfect contentment, and maps. Detailed maps showing how to find each location, how to approach potential recruits, how to establish new communities of temporal refugees. I was looking at the infrastructure of something vast and growing. A network of time fractures that offered escape from modern stress at the cost of accelerated aging and eventual absorption into a collective consciousness. The files contained profiles of thousands of people who'd been recruited over the decades. Stressed executives, struggling families, anyone who'd expressed a desire to get away from it all and really meant it. They were all still alive, in a sense, still existing in their chosen moments of peace, but no longer individual, no longer truly human. And according to the files, I was supposed to help expand the network. The aged version of myself that I'd seen in the time pool wasn't just a possible future. It was an expectation. I was meant to return to the world, slowly aging, but radiating the kind of peace that would attract others seeking escape. I would become a shepherd, guiding stressed urbanites to remote camping areas where they could find the same solution that had claimed Linda. But I had a choice. I could drive away, try to resume my normal life, and hope the aging process would stop. Or I could embrace my role in the network and help others find the peace that Linda had discovered. As I sat in our truck, feeling the weight of accumulated years in my bones, I understood the appeal. The world beyond these woods was full of conflict, stress, uncertainty. The network offered something simpler, the eternal moment of contentment, free from the pressures of linear time. All I had to do was accept it. I started the engine and drove toward the park exit, but at the last moment I found myself turning onto a side road. Not back toward the time pools, but toward a different destination entirely. The files on Linda's laptop had included detailed information about potential recruitment targets, people in crisis who might be susceptible to the network's appeal, and I found myself driving toward Portland, toward a life I could barely remember caring about, carrying with me the knowledge of places where time moved differently. The aged face in my rearview mirror smiled with vacant contentment. My coworkers have noticed the changes in me, but they attribute them to stress and the trauma of losing Linda. They think she left me, walked away from our marriage to find herself somewhere. I let them believe it. The truth would sound insane. I've aged another 5 years in the past 6 months, but the process has slowed now that I'm away from the time pools. The doctors can't explain it. They run tests, prescribe treatments, but there's no medical framework for understanding temporal displacement. What they do notice is how calm I've become, how centered and peaceful, even in the face of workplace crises that would have stressed me out before. My blood pressure is perfect. My sleep is deep and restorative. I radiate the kind of tranquility that people find magnetic, especially people who are struggling with the pressures of modern life. I've become exactly what the network intended. A living advertisement for the peace that can be found in places where time moves differently. I don't actively recruit, but I don't have to. People are drawn to the serenity that surrounds me like moths to flame. When they ask how I stay so calm, I tell them about the healing power of wilderness camping, about places far from cell towers and internet connections where you can really disconnect from the world's chaos. Some of them ask for specific recommendations. I always have suggestions. Remote areas in Oregon, Washington, Northern California, hidden campsites that aren't on any official maps but can be found if you know where to look, places where stressed urbanites can find the kind of deep peace that changes everything. I give them careful directions, casual mentions of forum posts where they can find more detailed information. I never push. The network has taught me that the most effective recruitment happens when people think they're making their own choices. In the past 6 months, I've had coffee with dozens of potential candidates. Stressed parents, overwhelmed executives, couples whose relationships are fracturing under modern pressures. All of them looking for escape, for something better than the endless cycle of work and worry that defines contemporary life. Most of them just want to vent, but some ask follow-up questions. Some research the locations I mention. Some plan camping trips to places where time moves differently. And some never come back. I tell myself I'm helping them find peace, that the network offers something genuinely better than the alternative. A release from temporal imprisonment disguised as progress, a chance to experience pure contentment, uncontaminated by the complications of linear existence. But late at night, when I look in the mirror and see how much older I've gotten, I wonder if I'm really helping anyone, or just feeding something that grows stronger with each new addition to its collective consciousness. The files on Linda's laptop are still there, updated regularly with information I don't remember adding. New locations appear, new profiles of potential recruits, new maps showing the expanding network of temporal refugees. Sometimes I find myself planning trips to these new locations, guided by impulses I don't fully understand. The network needs maintenance, after all. The time pools require tending, and the shepherds need coordination. I've become part of something larger than myself, something that values collective peace over individual growth, temporal escape over linear progress. And most of the time, that feels like the right choice. But sometimes, in brief moments of clarity, I remember who I used to be before Silver Falls. I remember Linda as she was, not as the collective consciousness she became. I remember having ambitions and fears and the messy complexity of individual existence. In those moments, I understand what I've lost, what we've all lost. But then the peace returns, and I remember why letting go feels so good. The network is patient. It doesn't need to convert everyone immediately. It just needs to exist, to offer an alternative to those who are ready to receive it. And there are always more people ready to escape from the complications of linear time. I should know. I helped them find their way. They warned us. Locals always do. But we laughed. My name's Tyler Hayes. I had just turned 31 when we arrived at Eagle Cap Wilderness, and it was the worst mistake of our lives. The first sign something was wrong came when I woke up with no memory of setting up camp. I found myself standing outside our 28-foot Fleetwood travel trailer at 6 a.m., fully dressed in hiking boots and a jacket I didn't remember putting on. My wife, Carmen, was still asleep inside, and according to my phone, we'd apparently arrived at this remote campsite in Oregon's Eagle Cap Wilderness the night before. But I couldn't remember any of it. Not the drive through the winding mountain roads, not choosing this particular spot, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines near the headwaters of the Menam River. Not unhitching the trailer, or leveling it, or connecting the propane. The last clear memory I had was eating breakfast at our hotel in La Grande, over 150 miles away. 8 hours of my life, just gone. I checked my phone for photos, anything that might trigger a memory. Nothing. Carmen's phone was the same. No pictures, no texts, no record of our journey into one of Oregon's most remote wilderness areas. It was as if we'd been sleepwalking for the entire day. Inside the trailer, I found evidence of our lost time. Groceries I didn't remember buying, arranged neatly in the refrigerator. A campfire ring built from local stones, cold but recently used. Our camping gear laid out with methodical precision. Everything exactly where it should be. But most disturbing was the notebook. I found it on our dinette table, filled with my own handwriting. Detailed notes about the area's history, local legends, and something called the Forgetting Place. Page after page of information I had no memory of researching or writing. According to my own notes, Eagle Cap Wilderness had an unusually high rate of missing persons cases. Hikers and campers who simply vanished, leaving behind perfectly organized campsites and no trace of struggle. The few who were found alive suffered from what authorities labeled severe amnesia and psychological trauma, but could never explain what had happened to them. The locals had a different explanation. They called it the memory thief. As I read my own handwriting describing an entity that fed on human memories, consuming entire experiences while leaving the body intact, Carmen stirred awake. "Morning, baby," she said, stretching. "Sleep well? Carmen, do you remember getting here yesterday?" She paused, a frown creasing her forehead. "Of course we drove from..." The frown deepened. "That's weird. I remember packing, and I remember being excited about the trip, but the actual drive is kind of fuzzy." I showed her the notebook. As she read, her face grew pale. "Did I write any of this? It's all my handwriting, but I don't remember writing it." She flipped through the pages, stopping at a hand-drawn map showing our exact location marked with an X. In the margin, I'd written, "Patient Zero Site. First documented case 1987. "Tyler, this is starting to freak me out. Maybe we should just leave." But even as she said it, I could see her resolve wavering. There was something about this place that made leaving feel impossible, like trying to remember a dream after waking. Every time I thought about packing up and driving away, the idea would slip away like water through my fingers. "Let's just stay for today," I heard myself saying. "We drove all this way." Carmen nodded, though I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Just today. But we'd been here for 3 days. I discovered this when I checked the weather app on my phone. According to the forecast, today was Thursday. The last day I remembered clearly was Monday morning in La Grande. We'd lost 3 days. Panicking, I ran outside and looked at our campsite with fresh eyes. The fire ring wasn't just recently used, it was worn, weathered, as if we'd been maintaining fires for weeks. Our camping chairs were arranged around it with the casual familiarity of a long-term setup. In the dirt around our trailer, I could see multiple sets of our own footprints, creating paths that spoke of routine and repetition. We'd been living here, following the same patterns, for days, but neither of us remembered any of it. I found Carmen standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the forest with a dreamy expression. When I called her name, she didn't respond. I had to touch her shoulder to get her attention. "What were you looking at?" I'm not sure. I thought I saw something moving between the trees. Something familiar. I followed her gaze but saw only shadows and undergrowth. Yet there was something about the forest that drew the eye, made you want to keep looking, keep walking deeper into the green darkness between the pines. "Carmen, we need to leave. Right now." She nodded, but her feet didn't move. We stood there for long minutes, both of us knowing we should return to the trailer and pack, both of us unable to take a single step away from the tree line. It was like being caught in psychological quicksand. When we finally broke free of whatever held us, the sun had moved significantly across the sky. Hours had passed in what felt like minutes. Back at the trailer, I tried to start the truck. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch. I checked the gas gauge. Full. The battery was fine. Everything seemed normal, but the truck simply wouldn't start. "Maybe it's flooded," Carmen suggested, though neither of us really believed it. I popped the hood and found the problem immediately. Someone had methodically disconnected essential components. Nothing damaged, just carefully removed and set aside. The distributor cap, several spark plug wires, the air filter housing. All the parts were there, organized in a neat pile as if someone had been working on the engine and intended to reassemble it later. But neither Carmen nor I knew anything about car engines. "Did you do this?" I asked, though the question was absurd. "Tyler, I can barely change a tire." I started putting the parts back together, working from half-remembered knowledge and logical guesswork. As I worked, Carmen read more from the notebook. "Listen to this," she said. "Day 3. The subject maintains the illusion of daily life while experiencing increasing memory gaps. Physical needs are met through unconscious behavior, eating, sleeping, basic maintenance, but conscious recollection decreases by approximately 30% per day. Subject shows no awareness of the process." She looked up at me. "Tyler, this sounds like we're being studied." I dropped the wrench I was holding. "What did you just read?" She looked down at the notebook again, confusion crossing her face. I don't remember. What was I reading?" The page in front of her was blank. I grabbed the notebook and flipped through it frantically. Every page I'd read earlier was now empty. My detailed notes about the memory thief, the maps, the case histories, all gone, as if they'd never existed. But I could still remember reading them, still recall the feeling of seeing my own handwriting describe something impossible. Carmen was staring at me with growing fear. "Tyler, what's happening to us?" Before I could answer, we heard voices coming from the forest. Multiple people, talking and laughing, their conversation growing closer. Relief flooded through me. Other campers, people who could help us figure out what was going on. But as the voices approached, I began to recognize them. They were our voices. Carmen's laugh, my own voice telling a story I couldn't quite make out. The conversation sounded like us around a campfire, relaxed and happy, completely normal except for one crucial detail. We were standing right here, listening to ourselves having a conversation somewhere in the woods. The voices grew closer, and I could make out fragments. Carmen talking about work, me describing a movie we'd seen, both of us planning activities for the next day. Normal couple conversation, except we were having it in 2 places at once. "That's us," Carmen whispered. "But how?" I grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the trailer. We're leaving. Now. We'll figure out the truck later, but we're walking out of here. But as soon as we took a step toward the forest edge, the voices stopped. Complete silence fell over the wilderness, so absolute it was like someone had turned off the world's volume. In that silence, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Coming from inside our trailer. Slow, methodical footsteps moving around inside our locked RV. The sound of someone, or something, going through our belongings with casual familiarity. Carmen and I stood frozen as the footsteps moved from the bedroom to the kitchen to the living area. Occasionally, we'd hear the clink of dishes being moved or the soft thud of cabinet doors opening and closing. "Is someone in there?" Carmen breathed. The footsteps stopped. Then, from inside the trailer, we heard my own voice. "Carmen, where did you go? I've been looking everywhere for you." And Carmen's voice responded, "I'm right here, honey. I was just making some coffee." We listened in horror as our own voices continued a perfectly normal domestic conversation while we stood outside, watching our trailer rock gently with the movement of whoever, or whatever, was impersonating us inside. The door opened and I saw myself step out, looking exactly like me in every detail. He turned toward where we stood and smiled with my face, but his eyes were wrong. Too bright, too knowing. Like someone wearing a mask they hadn't quite learned to operate. "There you are," he said in my voice. "We've been waiting for you." Carmen stepped out behind him. Identical to my wife except for the same wrongness in her eyes. She was holding 2 cups of coffee, steam rising in the mountain air. "Come inside," she said with Carmen's voice but a stranger's inflection. "We have so much to catch up on." The real Carmen beside me grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. "Tyler, what the hell is that?" But I couldn't answer, because looking at our doubles, I was beginning to remember things I'd forgotten. Fragments of the past 3 days were returning in horrifying flashes. Waking up multiple times to find ourselves already in conversation with these things, accepting their presence as normal until the memory faded again. Sitting around the campfire with them, sharing stories while our real selves watched from the tree line like ghosts haunting their own lives. The things wearing our faces had been living our lives, practicing being us, while we existed in a kind of dream state, forgetting each encounter as soon as it ended. But now, for some reason, the forgetting wasn't working as well. "You're remembering more each time," said the thing with my face, setting down his coffee cup. "That's not supposed to happen. The process should be seamless by now." The Carmen thing tilted her head with an expression my wife had never made. "Perhaps these specimens are unusually resistant. We may need to adjust the methodology." They spoke about us like we were laboratory animals, using our own voices to discuss our disposal with clinical detachment. That's when I understood what was happening in Eagle Cap Wilderness. The memory thief wasn't some supernatural entity. It was something that wore human faces and stole human lives, replacing people piece by piece until nothing remained but perfectly crafted copies. And we were next. The real Carmen was backing away, pulling me with her, but our doubles were already moving to cut off our escape routes. They moved with inhuman coordination, communicating through subtle gestures and shared glances. "The process is almost complete," my double said, his voice carrying just enough of my inflection to be believable. "Soon, you won't remember any of this discomfort. You won't remember anything at all." "What are you?" I demanded. "We're you," the Carmen thing replied with a smile that was almost right. "We're what you're becoming. The forest needs new growth, new experiences to sustain itself. You've provided excellent raw material." I realized then that the entire Eagle Cap Wilderness might be filled with these things. Hikers and campers who'd never left, their bodies walking familiar trails while something else looked out through their eyes. All those missing persons cases, all those amnesia victims who were found but never quite seemed like themselves afterward. They'd been replaced. And now it was our turn. The harvest protocol. My double reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device that looked like a hearing aid crossed with a computer chip. As he held it up, I could see it pulsing with a soft blue light. "Memory extraction is most efficient when the subject is calm," he explained in my own voice. This device creates a feedback loop between your hippocampus and our organic network. Your experiences become our experiences. Your personalities become templates for improvement. The Carmen thing moved closer, holding an identical device. The beautiful part is that you'll feel peaceful during the process, like falling asleep and waking up as someone better. Carmen squeezed my hand tighter. Tyler, I'm starting to remember more. Pieces of the last few days. We've done this before, haven't we? They've tried this before. She was right. Images were flooding back. Multiple attempts at the extraction. Each one partially successful before we somehow snapped back to awareness. Each time, we forgot a little more of who we really were, while our doubles became more convincing. We were caught in a loop, being harvested piece by piece. You're surprisingly resilient, my double admitted, the device in his hand pulsing faster. Most subjects require only 1 or 2 sessions before complete integration. You've managed 7 attempts. 7? The number hit me like ice water. We'd been here for over a week, losing ourselves by degrees while these things refined their impersonations. The Carmen thing stepped forward, and I could see that her appearance was subtly different from my real wife. Her face slightly more symmetrical, her movements more graceful. She was an improved version, designed to be more appealing than the original. Each extraction makes us better, she said. We take your flaws and optimize them. Your marriage will be happier with us than it ever was with you. Because you're not real, Carmen said, her voice stronger than I'd heard it all week. You're wearing our lives like costumes. Reality is subjective, my double replied. We experience your memories as if they were our own. We feel your emotions. We continue your relationships. In every meaningful way, we are you. But as he spoke, I noticed something crucial. A slight delay in his responses, like he was accessing files rather than drawing from genuine experience. The technology was impressive, but it wasn't perfect, and that gave me an idea. If you're really me, I said, then you'll know about the scar on my left shoulder, the one from when I was 8. My double's confident expression flickered for just a moment. Of course, the bicycle accident. Wrong. I pulled up my shirt, revealing the small crescent-shaped scar. Dog bite, my neighbor's German shepherd when I tried to climb their fence. The thing wearing my face recalibrated quickly. A minor memory optimization. The bicycle accident is a more cohesive narrative. But Carmen had caught on to my strategy. What about our first dance? She asked her double. At our wedding. What song? The Carmen thing smiled confidently. At Last, by Etta James. We didn't have a first dance, Carmen said. I sprained my ankle an hour before the ceremony. We spent our wedding night in the emergency room. Both doubles exchanged a look that was unmistakably inhuman. Too quick, too coordinated, like components of the same machine communicating through invisible networks. Memory discrepancies are common during the integration process, my double said, but his voice had lost some of its warmth. These inconsistencies will be resolved. Resolved how? I pressed. By deleting the parts of us that don't fit your programming? The doubles were moving closer now, the devices in their hands pulsing more rapidly. I could feel a strange tugging sensation in my mind, like someone trying to access files on a locked computer. The process is inevitable, the Carmen thing said. You've already contributed most of your essential patterns. We have your voices, your mannerisms, your relationship dynamics. What remains is simply cleanup. I felt my thoughts becoming fuzzy, memories starting to blur at the edges. The device was working, drawing out the last pieces of our authentic selves. But as my vision began to fade, I caught sight of something that gave me hope. Our truck, with the hood still open and engine parts scattered around it. The doubles had made one crucial mistake. They'd been so focused on perfecting their psychological camouflage that they'd overlooked the physical evidence of their interference. Carmen, I whispered, fighting against the mental fog. The truck, the parts. They had to disable it to keep us here. She understood immediately. While our doubles closed in for the final extraction, we broke apart and ran in different directions. The psychological compulsion to stay was strong, but panic gave us the adrenaline to break free. I reached the truck and started frantically reassembling the engine while Carmen grabbed our emergency kit from the trailer. Behind us, I could hear our doubles coordinating their pursuit, their voices losing their human inflections as they communicated in rapid, technical bursts. Subjects are exhibiting anomalous resistance levels. Recommend immediate emergency extraction protocols. Organic network integrity may be compromised. I got the distributor cap back on and turned the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. Carmen dove into the passenger seat as our doubles reached the truck, their faces now shifting and distorting like malfunctioning holograms. Their carefully crafted human appearances were breaking down under stress. I gunned the engine and we tore out of the campsite, leaving our trailer behind but escaping with our lives, and more importantly, our memories intact. In the rearview mirror, I watched our doubles standing in the clearing, their faces completely blank now, like mannequins waiting for new programming. As we reached the main road, the oppressive mental fog began to lift. For the first time in over a week, my thoughts felt clear and fully my own. "Are we safe?" Carmen asked, looking back at the forest. "I don't know, but at least we remember who we are." Epilogue. 6 months later. We never reported what happened in Eagle Cap Wilderness. Who would believe us? Instead, we quietly researched missing persons cases in the area and found a pattern that chilled us to the bone. Dozens of people had vanished in that region over the past decade, but even more disturbing were the cases of people who'd been found. Hikers and campers who'd returned home safely but whose families later reported subtle personality changes. Spouses who seemed off in indefinable ways. Children who came back from camping trips with their parents but felt like strangers to their siblings. Gradual behavioral shifts that were easy to dismiss as trauma or stress. We began to suspect that many people hadn't really returned from Eagle Cap Wilderness at all, that what came home were improved copies, living better versions of the lives they'd stolen. Carmen and I moved to Florida and changed our names. We monitor missing persons reports obsessively and have identified similar patterns in remote wilderness areas across the country. The harvest is spreading. Sometimes, late at night, I catch Carmen staring at me with a strange expression, as if she's studying my responses to see if they're authentic. And sometimes I wonder if my memory of our escape is real, or if I'm just a very sophisticated copy programmed to believe I survived. The worst part is that I can't be sure. The real Tyler and Carmen might still be in that forest, trapped in an endless loop of partial memory extraction while we, their copies, lived their lives with the comforting illusion of authenticity. After all, wouldn't a perfect copy be programmed to believe it was real? Yesterday, I found a notebook in my handwriting that I don't remember creating. It contained detailed information about wilderness areas in Florida, local legends, and something called the Everglades Protocol. I'm starting to think we never really escaped Eagle Cap Wilderness. I think something followed us home. And I think the harvest is just beginning.